Nathan Hale had always considered himself a rational man. A retired history professor, he approached most things in life with a quiet, measured perspective. But when his golden retriever, Cooper, began leaving dead birds on his doorstep, a strange unease settled in his chest. At first, he dismissed it as instinct. After all, Cooper was a dog, and dogs sometimes had odd behaviors. But it wasn't just once or twice. It was every morning, the same routine, a small, lifeless bird carefully placed by the door, as if Cooper believed he was offering Nathan a gift. Nathan tried to break the habit, keeping Cooper inside at night. But the moment he let him out, the dog would sprint to the backyard as if drawn by an invisible force. Then, one evening, as the last light of day bled into dusk, Nathan watched as Cooper returned from the far end of the yard. His paws caked with dirt. His heart thumped a little harder. Curiosity got the best of him, and he followed the dog's tracks back to a large oak tree near the fence line. The ground was freshly disturbed, a shallow hole dug beneath the gnarled roots. Cooper, sensing his master's presence, let out a soft whimper and nudged the dirt with his nose. Nathan exhaled and grabbed a nearby spade. His hands, though weathered with age, still had the strength to dig. The deeper he went, the more solid the earth became, until suddenly, the blade of his spade struck something hard. He cleared away the dirt with careful precision, revealing an old wooden box. Its surface cracked and worn with age. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. Someone had buried this here, long ago. But why? With slightly trembling fingers, he pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in brittle yellowed paper, was a stack of old black and white photographs. Nathan's breath hitched. The images depicted a family, stern-looking men in suits, women in modest dresses, children standing stiffly in front of a house. His house. Nathan's stomach twisted. He shuffled through the photographs. The faces frozen in time staring back at him. The style of clothing suggested the early 1900s. But he couldn't place an exact date. As he reached the bottom of the stack, his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper, its edges worn, its surface covered in shaky handwriting. He unfolded it carefully. "Hey Giup Toy." The words, scrawled in faded ink, sent a chill through his bones. The handwriting was frantic, the strokes uneven, as if written by someone in distress. Nathan stood there for a long moment, his breath slow and measured, the night air suddenly colder than before. He glanced at Cooper, who sat patiently, tail still, his golden eyes fixed on the box as if waiting for something more to be revealed. Nathan looked back at the note. The plea was simple, direct, but it left more questions than answers. Who had buried this? Why had they asked for help? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, why had Cooper found it now? Nathan had lived in this house for nearly 20 years. It was old, yes, but he had never thought much about its past. The deed had been clean when he purchased it. No records of crimes, no local legends about hauntings. Just an ordinary, aging home in a quiet neighborhood. But now, as he stood in the dimming twilight, the ordinary seemed far away. He took the box inside. Placing it carefully on his worn oak dining table, he spread the photos out, studying the faces, searching for anything familiar. The people in the images had sharp, defined features, high cheekbones, solemn eyes. But there was one picture that made his breath hitch. A young girl, no older than 10, stood at the edge of a group photo, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Unlike the others, whose faces were impassive, hers was filled with something else. Fear. Nathan ran a hand through his silvered hair. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe an old owner had simply left the box behind. Maybe the note was a hoax. But deep down, he knew better. Someone had buried this box for a reason. And somehow, through fate or instinct, Cooper had found it. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window made Nathan's mind race. He dreamt of the little girl in the photograph. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. By morning, his decision was made. He would find out who she was. Nathan sat at his kitchen table. The old photographs spread out before him, his fingers tracing the edges of the one that unsettled him the most. The image of a young Eleanor Price standing stiffly in front of his house. Her gaze haunted, her hands balled into tight fists. And there, in the background, barely noticeable if one wasn't looking for him, the man. His presence in the photo was unnerving. He stood at a distance, half hidden behind a tree, his face blurred, but his posture unmistakable. He was watching. Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had spent the morning scouring old newspaper archives online, piecing together the fragmented story of Eleanor Price. She had vanished in 1972. One night, she simply disappeared from this very house, never to be seen again. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just gone. Her case had made headlines for a while. The town had been consumed by rumors, suspicions. Police had questioned her fiancé, James Beckett, repeatedly, but they never found any evidence to charge him. Eventually, the case went cold, slipping into the realm of whispered town lore. Just another mystery that faded with time. Nathan exhaled, his eyes flickering back to the note from the buried box. Hey Giup Toy. Had Eleanor written this? Had she known something was coming? Nathan needed to speak to James Beckett. James Beckett lived in a small, weathered house at the edge of town. The place had the look of a man who had given up on making things new, faded curtains. A rusted mailbox leaning on its post. The grass left untamed. Nathan knocked. A long pause. Then, the sound of slow, careful footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing a man who had been worn down by years rather than just age. His once strong frame had withered, his pale blue eyes dull and distant. But when they landed on Nathan, something flickered, curiosity, maybe even recognition. "Mr. Beckett?" Nathan asked. The old man hesitated. "Depends on who's asking. My name is Nathan Hale. I live in the house on Sycamore Street." "Eleanor's house." James inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the edge of the door. "That was a long time ago." He muttered. "I know," Nathan said. his voice steady. "But I found something buried in the yard. A box. With pictures. And a note." James's expression shifted. His guarded suspicion replaced with something else. Something like fear. Without a word, he pushed the door open and gestured for Nathan to come inside. The living room was cluttered but comfortable. Old books lined the shelves, their spines cracked with age. A clock ticked softly from the mantel, filling the silence as James lowered himself into a chair and rubbed his weathered hands together. "You found a note," he murmured, as if speaking to himself. Nathan nodded. It said, "Hey gi up toy." James closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She knew," he said. "She knew something was coming. But no one believed her." Nathan leaned forward. "Knew what, exactly?" James let out a slow breath. Eleanor was scared in the weeks before she disappeared. She started saying she was being followed. That she saw someone outside the house at night. I thought maybe she was just anxious. Or imagining things. I told her she was safe." His voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong." Nathan placed the photograph in front of him, the one with Eleanor and the mysterious man. "Is this him?" Nathan asked. James's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the photo. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "Richard Vance." Nathan frowned. "Who is Richard Vance?" James let out a humorless laugh. "That's the question, isn't it?" He set the photo down. "Vance wasn't from here. He came to town about a year before Eleanor disappeared. No one really knew much about him. He was polite, well-dressed, said he was a traveling businessman. But there was something off about him. People said he asked a lot of questions. Always seemed to know things he shouldn't." Nathan's unease deepened. "And he was watching Eleanor?" James nodded. "She told me he was always there. At the grocery store, sitting in his car near the house. I told her it was just a coincidence. That she was imagining it. Then one day, she told me she had proof." "Proof of what?" Nathan asked. James's eyes darkened. "She wouldn't say, just that she had something on him. And then, the night before she vanished, she called me, terrified. She said, if anything happens to me, it's because of Richard Vance." A silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Nathan's mind whirled. If Eleanor had proof, had she buried it in that box? Or had she hidden something else? Something Nathan had yet to find. And Vance? Nathan asked. What happened to him? James's jaw tightened. He left town right after Eleanor disappeared. No warning, no goodbyes. Just gone. Nathan felt his heartbeat quicken. You think he killed her? James exhaled. I don't know, but I know this. Eleanor was scared. And then she was gone. And Vance disappeared with her secrets. Nathan sat back, absorbing everything. This wasn't just some buried relic of the past. Something had happened in that house. Something dark. And now, Cooper had led him straight to it. James studied him carefully. You're not going to let this go, are you? Nathan shook his head. I need to know what happened to her. James sighed, rubbing his temples. Then start with the house. He said, if Eleanor hid something, she hid it there. Nathan nodded, already making a plan. That house held more than memories. It held secrets. And Nathan was going to find them. Nathan's fingers trembled as he held the worn piece of paper in his hands. The message was simple, but it sent a chill through his bones. An dang den gan roy. The wooden box in front of him contained more than just a cryptic warning. Inside were old, yellowed photographs, their edges curling with time. He flipped through them, his breath tightening in his chest. They were all portraits of women, different ages, different features, but they shared one thing in common. They were all missing. His pulse quickened as his eyes scanned the faded images. He recognized one of them immediately, Eleanor Price, staring back at him with the same haunted expression she had in the photo buried under his backyard tree. But there were others, too, women he didn't know, women whose disappearances had never been solved. Nathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was no coincidence. Richard Vance had been more than just a shadow in Eleanor's life. He had been a predator. And if these photos meant what he thought they did, he hadn't stopped with her. A creak echoed from somewhere deep in the abandoned house. Nathan stiffened. He wasn't alone. The realization sent a jolt through his system. His grip on the photographs tightened as he turned toward the sound. The house was silent again. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker. His instincts screamed at him, "Get out!" He shoved the photographs and note back into the wooden box, snapped the lid shut, and hurried toward the door. The floorboards groaned under his hurried steps. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, like it was pressing against his skin. Just as he reached the exit, he stole one last glance over his shoulder, through the dust-covered window. In the dimming evening light, a figure stood at the tree line, watching. Nathan's stomach twisted. He didn't wait to see if the figure moved. He bolted to his car, throwing the box onto the passenger seat, his hands shaking as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. In his rearview mirror, the figure at the edge of the woods was gone. By the time Nathan reached home, night had fully descended. The weight of what he had discovered pressed against him like an iron vice. His mind raced with possibilities, theories, fears. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. The wooden box rested beside him, its presence unnerving. He hadn't opened it again during the drive. He didn't need to. He already knew the truth. Richard Vance had been responsible for more than just Eleanor Price's disappearance. He had been a hunter, and his prey had been women. Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He needed to go to the police. He needed to tell someone, anyone, what he had found. But first, he needed to get inside. As soon as he stepped out of the car, a sharp wind cut through the night. The air smelled of damp earth, of autumn closing in. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves. Then he saw them, footprints, leading straight to his front door. His stomach dropped. The prints weren't his. And worse, they didn't lead away. Whoever had left them had come to his house, but never left. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the porch. Nathan's eyes snapped to Cooper, his golden retriever standing stiff. Ears pinned back, teeth bared. His hackles were raised. His eyes locked onto the door. Nathan swallowed hard. He reached into his pocket, gripping his phone. His first instinct was to call someone, to get help. But then he saw it. The door wasn't fully closed. A crack of darkness loomed where the lock should have clicked shut. Someone had been here, or was still inside. Nathan moved carefully, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He bent down, murmuring to Cooper in a quiet, steady voice, "Good boy, stay with me." The dog's body remained tense. But he didn't move away. His gaze stayed fixed on the doorway. Nathan pushed the door open. The house was dark. Too dark. He knew exactly which lights he had left on before he left. None of them were on now. His breath was slow, deliberate. As he stepped inside, the air felt wrong, thick with something unseen. The silence was absolute. Then, in the dimness, he saw it. A single object sat on the floor, directly in the center of the living room. One of the photographs from the box. Nathan's blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Someone had taken the time to enter his house, move unnoticed, and leave this as a message. Cooper let out another low growl, his body rigid beside Nathan's leg. Nathan reached for the nearest light switch, flicking it on. The room flooded with yellow light. No one was there. No sign of a break-in. No overturned furniture. Just the photo, sitting alone on the hardwood floor. Nathan stepped closer, his pulse pounding. He bent down, picked it up. It was a photograph of Eleanor Price. But something was different. Something had been added. A single word, scrawled in ink across the bottom of the photo. In handwriting that looked frantic. Almost desperate. "Dung Lai." Nathan inhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the photo. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Someone didn't want him to keep looking. And whoever they were close. Nathan Hale drove through the darkened streets, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. The weight of the discoveries pressed down on him. Eleanor Price. Richard Vance. The warnings that had followed him ever since he unearthed that box. He had thought he was investigating a decades-old crime, a mystery tied to a single man's disappearance. But now, it was clear, this was much bigger than that. Elijah Carter had been waiting for him at a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. The journalist was in his late 60s. A man whose once sharp features had been softened by years of chasing stories that no one wanted to believe. His eyes, however, remained alert, filled with an intensity that told Nathan he had spent too long searching for answers that others had ignored. "You shouldn't have dug into this," Elijah said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as Nathan slid into the booth across from him. "You don't know what you've stumbled into." Nathan pulled out the photograph, the one left in his house. The one marked with the warning, "Dung Lai." "Someone broke into my house and left this," he said, his voice steady despite the unease curling in his gut. "And I found a second box, one filled with photos of other missing women. This isn't just about Eleanor Price." Elijah studied the photograph for a long moment before exhaling deeply. "No," he said, "it never was. Nathan frowned. "You knew? I've been chasing this for years," Elijah admitted, setting down his cup. "I started looking into the disappearances decades ago, when I was still writing for the town paper. The more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't the work of a single man. Not just some serial killer. Not just Richard Vance." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is something older, darker." Nathan felt his skin prickle. "Explain." Elijah's gaze flickered to the window, as if ensuring no one was listening. Vance was obsessed with an ancient ritual, a belief that through sacrifice, one could commune with something beyond this world. He paused, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "The people who disappeared, they didn't just die, they were taken, offered up as part of something far worse." Nathan's chest tightened. "Taken by who?" Elijah shook his head. "Not who. What?" Silence stretched between them. Nathan wanted to dismiss it as nonsense. The ramblings of an old journalist who had spent too long chasing ghosts. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Elijah was telling the truth, because nothing else made sense. The warnings, the eerie presence outside his home, the feeling of being watched. "Where does this lead?" Nathan asked finally. Elijah pulled out a map from his worn leather satchel. He unfolded it with care, his fingers tracing a red-marked location. "Here," he said, "Holloway Ridge." Nathan frowned. "The ghost town?" Elijah nodded. "It was abandoned in the late 1800s. People left in a hurry. No clear reason why. The official records claim an economic collapse. But the stories say otherwise. There were rumors, whispers of strange disappearances, of things seen in the woods at night. And now, all these years later, Richard Vance was seen near there before he disappeared." Nathan's gut twisted. "You think that's where this all ends?" Elijah's expression darkened. "I think that's where it begins." The road to Holloway Ridge was long and winding. The trees on either side thick and oppressive. The deeper they drove into the forgotten town, the heavier the air became, as if the very land itself carried the weight of everything that had happened here. The headlights of Nathan's truck cut through the thick fog that had begun to settle, illuminating the crumbling remains of the buildings that had been left to rot. The town was eerily silent. Elijah unfolded his map, squinting at the faded lines. "There should be a clearing up ahead," he said. "That's where the reports say the strange symbols were found." Nathan pressed forward, Cooper restless in the back seat. The dog had been silent for most of the drive. But now, as they neared their destination, his ears pinned back, his body tense. Nathan knew better than to ignore his instincts. The truck rolled to a stop. They stepped out into the cold night air, their breath visible in the dim moonlight. The ruins of the town loomed around them, skeletal remains of homes long forgotten. And in the center of the clearing, the symbols. Nathan's stomach twisted as he stepped closer. The markings were carved deep into the earth, spirals and jagged lines forming a pattern that felt both intentional and wrong. The more he stared at them, the more his vision seemed to blur at the edges, a low hum filling the air. "This is it," Elijah murmured. "This is where it happened." Nathan swallowed hard. Where? What happened? Before Elijah could answer, Cooper let out a low, warning growl. Nathan's body went rigid. They weren't alone. From the darkness of the ruined buildings, shadows began to shift. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. At first, he thought it was a trick of the dim light, the way the fog rolled through the hollowed-out streets. But then, one of them moved. Elijah took a sharp step back. "We need to go." Nathan didn't argue. His instincts screamed at him to turn, to run. But even as they backed away, the figures in the shadows stepped closer. Tall, wrong, their movements unnatural, limbs too long, as if something had worn a human shape but had forgotten how it was supposed to move. Cooper barked, the sound sharp and frantic. And then, a whisper. Low, curling around them like smoke. "You should not have come." Nathan's blood ran cold. The voice was neither male nor female. Distant yet impossibly close. It came from everywhere. Elijah grabbed his arm. "Nathan, run." They didn't need to be told twice. They turned and sprinted for the truck, feet pounding against the frozen earth. Cooper was ahead of them, his body a blur of movement as he barked wildly at the approaching darkness. Nathan reached the driver's seat just as the air behind him shifted. A hand, or something like it, grazed the back of his coat. He slammed the door shut. Elijah barely made it into the passenger seat before Nathan threw the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as they sped out of Holloway Ridge. Nathan's heart pounded violently against his ribs. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. He gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, refusing to look back. Behind them, the fog thickened, and in the rearview mirror, just before the town disappeared into the night, the shadows watched them go. Nathan's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stood at the center of the ancient ruins. His gaze locked onto the massive stone slab before him. The ground beneath them felt alive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic tremor, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. Cooper let out a low, uneasy growl, his golden fur bristling, while Elijah Carter clutched a rusted crowbar in his trembling hands. "This is it," Elijah muttered, his voice barely audible over the unnatural hum that filled the air. "The center of everything." Nathan stepped forward, the heavy sledgehammer in his grip slick with sweat. The markings on the stone seemed to shift under the dim moonlight, twisting and curling like living things. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, an unspoken warning in the stillness. "Are you sure about this?" Elijah asked, glancing warily at the shifting shadows at the edges of the ruins. The figures that had been pursuing them had stopped moving, standing eerily still, their hollow eyes fixed on the slab. It was as if they were waiting. "We don't have a choice," Nathan said through gritted teeth. "If this is what's keeping this thing alive, we have to destroy it." He raised the sledgehammer high above his head and swung. The impact sent a deep, resonant crack through the air. The stone shuddered, but it did not break. Instead, the tremors beneath their feet intensified, a low, guttural roar rising from the earth itself. Elijah swore under his breath. "Do it again." Nathan didn't hesitate. He swung a second time, the force of the blow jarring his bones. This time, a fracture split across the surface of the stone. Jagged and deep, a sound like whispering voices erupted around them, slithering through the ruins like a gust of wind filled with secrets. Then, the ground began to open. A fissure split through the earth, widening with each passing second. From the depths of the chasm, something massive began to rise. Not a man, not a beast, something older, something wrong. Nathan staggered backward, gripping the sledgehammer like a lifeline as the entity emerged, a shifting, writhing form, its skin the color of burnt stone, its eyes black voids that swallowed the moonlight. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. The figures around them remained motionless, their heads tilted upward in silent reverence. Cooper barked wildly, his instincts screaming at him to flee. Elijah grabbed Nathan's arm. "One more hit. You have to finish it." Nathan's mind raced. The entity was still rising, its enormous form pulling itself from the depths of the earth. It was almost free. With a final, desperate cry, Nathan swung the sledgehammer one last time. The stone shattered. A shock wave of energy blasted outward, knocking them off their feet. The fissure beneath them collapsed, pulling everything into its gaping maw. The monstrous entity let out a scream, not of pain, but of rage, as it was dragged back down into the abyss. The ground sealed shut with a deafening finality. Then, silence. Nathan lay there, chest heaving, dust settling around him. Cooper nudged his side, whining softly, and he slowly pushed himself up, his muscles aching from exertion. Elijah sat up, coughing. "Is it gone?" Nathan scanned the ruins. The shadows that had once surrounded them were gone. The whispers had faded. The night was still once more. "I think so," he muttered. For the first time in days, he felt the oppressive weight in his chest begin to lift. Whatever had been lurking beneath this place, whatever had been feeding off of it, was sealed away. At least, that's what he told himself. But the uneasy feeling in his gut remained. They made their way back to the truck, neither speaking as they climbed inside. Nathan turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. A strangely comforting sound after the horrors they had just faced. As he reached for the gearshift, something caught his eye. Sitting on the passenger seat was a photograph. Nathan's breath hitched. It was him. A picture taken just moments ago. Standing in the ruins with the shattered stone behind him. His face was barely visible in the dim light. But there was no mistaking it. Someone had been watching. Someone had been close enough to capture this moment. His hands tightened around the edges of the photo. At the bottom, in scrawled, uneven handwriting, were 4 words: Chung Ta She Gap Lai. Nathan's grip on the wheel turned white-knuckled. Cooper let out a soft whimper from the backseat. Elijah stared at the photo, his expression grim. "I don't think it's over, Nathan." Nathan exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the picture. No, it wasn't over, not yet. The thing was buried, but something else was still watching, waiting, and one day, it would return.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.